It's crazy to think that in 1987, 30 years ago, the character Vodka Drunkenski had to be changed to Soda Popinski for the release of Nintendo's Punch-Out in America. Localization isn't exactly censorship, it's more about game changes made to make things more suitable for certain regions and cultures, whether it's removing things deemed inappropriate in that country or changing the language and character names. And there's definitely been a lot of changes over the years. Hi, I'm Adrian with The Leaderboard, and today we're taking a look back at 3 decades worth of game changes for different regions. This is the top 10 games censored in localization. Number 10. Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV made so many changes for localization, it's hard to even talk about it. I mean, literally, it's hard to identify which game we're talking about. You see, since Final Fantasy II and III weren't released in America, Final Fantasy IV was retitled Final Fantasy II for its American release to maintain continuity. Does all that make sense? Just to be clear, we'll be referring to this game as Final Fantasy IV, its original title, from here on out. In Final Fantasy IV, many other changes were made for American localization. Much of the religious language was removed to accommodate Christian sensibilities. Death spells were changed to say Doom, because somehow that's better, even though characters still died in the game. Squaresoft also opted to change holy spells to White or Pearl, which was slightly confusing. I mean, it's been over 20 years and we're still trying to figure out what a Pearl spell is. There was also a porn magazine which was cut from the game. The magazine Playboy could only be found on the bookshelves of the bonus programmer's room, but losing the magazine wasn't a huge loss for American audiences, as the screen just turned pink when you read it. Number 9. Final Fantasy VI. When Final Fantasy VI was finally released in America, the name of the game was also changed. Like 2 and 3, Squaresoft had decided to skip over Final Fantasy V and move straight for Final Fantasy VI for the American market, calling it Final Fantasy III. That's pretty easy to follow, right? Again, we'll be referring to this game by its original title, Final Fantasy VI. But the localization doesn't end there. In fact, so much of the story was cut and so many names changed that you could almost make the case that the American version should be called Final Fantasy VI Lite, Tide Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy VI Sprite Remix. From Tina to Terra, Kate Sith to Stray, programmers changed the names of characters and espers alike, so it was hard to talk to gamers from Japan about the plot. There's also some scandalous pixelated skins censored on certain espers and enemies in the American version, and they changed all the pubs to cafes. While many of the story changes were due to cultural differences and trying to present the game more effectively to a new audience, some weren't even on purpose. In one major change, Setzer Gabbiani, the Han Solo of Final Fantasy VI, said that business had dried up under the Empire's rule in the Japanese version of the game, but in the American version, Setzer says exactly the opposite, that business had been great under the Empire. Game Boy Advance translator Tom Slattery explains, "My guess is that the original translator wasn't familiar with the idiom dried up, and translated it literally, assuming it meant business had gone up or improved rather than evaporated. This small mistake changed the entire dynamic of the scene for American audiences. In the Japanese game, Setzer is helping the group because it benefits both his financial and moral goals. In the American version, the group has to convince Setzer to work against his financial benefit. Later versions of the game would correct this issue, but they censored a different scene in its place. In the Game Boy Advance reissue of Final Fantasy VI, with the correct title, Celeste's introduction, which involved her being chained to a wall and punched several times, was altered because of concerns over Japanese kidnappings. So overall, this had to be one of the most famously localized games in history. Number 8. Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back. Now let's turn to one of the craziest examples of localization, and one of the hardest to confirm. There's a rumor on the internet that a small detail in the death of Crash Bandicoot in Cortex Strikes Back was changed for the Japanese release because of a notorious serial killer on the loose. When Crash was smashed in certain situations, he would turn into just a head and shoes. Apparently, Japanese distributors found this comical death too similar to an incident where somebody's head and shoes were found on a doorstep. Now, as we said, this rumor is hard to confirm, but there are 3 things we can say with great certainty. First, this rumor was started by Andy Gavin, blogger and co-founder of Naughty Dog, who created Crash Bandicoot, so there has to be some validity given the source. Second, by all accounts, the changes made to this death are subtle, as Crash can still be crushed in the Japanese version, albeit with slightly changed animation. And 3, if there's a famous serial killer from that time period that fits this profile, it's Boy A. In 1997, the year Crash 2 was released, Boy A committed the Kobe child murders, which are way too dark to talk about in this video. But with all this in mind, I think we can confirm that Gavin's story is probably true, and that Crash Bandicoot was in fact changed for a Japanese release. Number 7. Final Fantasy VII. Okay, one more Final Fantasy, and this is really the last one. By the time Final Fantasy VII came out, video games had grown up quite a bit. Mature titles like Resident Evil and Tomb Raider had both come out for the PlayStation, and as Final Fantasy had moved from Nintendo to Sony, they were no longer beholden to Nintendo's family-friendly approach. So gone were the days of having to censor alcohol references and holy spells, but Squaresoft still didn't think we were ready to read a few dirty words. Even with the T rating, the word shit was censored a few times in the American release, and while some of the other censorships you see in games appear in both the Japanese and American versions, some were never meant to appear at all. In one odd instance, an overzealous editor of the American PC version censored Tifa's use of the word wench when egging on Scarlet during their infamous slap fight, and if we think that Shakespeare could say it, a video game in the 90s should have been able to say it, but maybe that's just us. Number 6. Final Fantasy VIII. Okay, we lied, but this is really the final one, for real, we promise, and it'll be fast. While previous Final Fantasies had issues with content, nudity, and language, Final Fantasy VIII had issues with organs. Specifically, they had issues with the color of organs. A small change was made in the American version of Final Fantasy VIII when Ghetto Ghetto, a frightening boss from Disc 1, had his organs changed from red to blue. Though we will admit he looked a bit scary in the red, this seemed like a small issue, especially since they didn't bother changing the colors in any of the official guides. But the image of Ghetto Ghetto that haunts the nightmares of many American gamers is still blue. Told you guys it'll be fast. Number 5. World of Warcraft. Small changes were made to World of Warcraft in most of its regional localizations. In Europe, 2 quests which involved getting drunk, the Wolpertinger and Pink Alex quest, had to be removed because of regional rating laws. It's fascinating that Europe decided it had to censor a drinking quest which was allowed in the US, considering Europe has more lenient laws for teenagers drinking in real life. In the Chinese version of the game, even more extreme changes had to be made. Blood isn't red, and many of the bones were cut from the game. There's some discussion among gamers about why these changes were made, since other Chinese games, like Age of Wushu, included skeletons and bones. But it appears that Blizzard made these changes before even submitting the game for review in China, in hopes that it would speed up the game's approval. So we'll never know if World of Warcraft would have made it through Chinese censorship boards without the changes being made at all. However, we do know that China banned the entire Lich King expansion upon release, partially because the skeleton characters weren't censored, so maybe it was for the best. Number 4. The Last of Us. The Last of Us is one of the more violent games in recent memory, and it was pretty heavily censored in its European release, for mostly sensible reasons. By European rating definitions, you can't mutilate other players, so dismemberment or head explosions had to be cut for multiplayer modes, and that makes some sense since those are real people and not just NPCs. But the Japanese localized version is even more censored, as dismemberment isn't even possible in single player mode. They even removed a cutscene with Ellie which involved a corpse being sliced up. Specifically, the camera angle in the Japanese version is altered so that you can't see the corpse straight on. Number 3. Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. 2 fatalities had to be changed for the US release of Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. The Joker and Deathstroke's fatalities involving gunshots were effectively removed. In the American version, the camera pans away from the winner right before the shot occurs, so you can't see the victim when he's shot. In the UK version, however, you can see the full gunshot fatality. For a game that allows you to break people's necks and spines and shoot people with missiles, this seems like an odd choice. And again, it runs counterintuitive to actual laws. In the US, we have fairly loose gun laws, but the game's guns were censored. In the UK, where guns are effectively banned, they allowed it. Very strange. Number 2. The Witcher and Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. The Witcher series features a huge amount of blood and sex, and it's the sex that keeps getting the games in trouble with censors. For the US release of the original Witcher, all the cards from Geralt's sexual conquests had to be censored. However, with Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, even more drastic changes had to be made for the game's release in Japan and the Middle East. The violence and nudity were both drastically reduced. This includes censoring the entrails of certain lifeless victims, making them appear hollow inside, and putting clothes on various naked characters. The lack of nudity can create some amusing sequences. For example, Kira wears clothes even when she's bathing, which suggests that, like Tobias from Arrested Development, she might be a never nude. Number 1. Xenoblade Chronicles Cross. In one of the most talked about examples of localization, Xenoblade Chronicles Cross changed some minor details for their customization options of the American release of the game. Specifically, a feature that allowed gamers to adjust the breast size of the protagonist was dropped, and a bikini outfit which could be worn by a 13-year-old was also cut. According to creators, in order to release the game for American audiences, they originally considered creating a crotch modifier for the male characters as a companion to the breast resizer to better address gender equality. However, after playing around with the feature, they found it to be too cumbersome for actual gameplay. While a section of the fanbase felt that these changes somehow affected the overall quality and presentation of the game, most people agree that these kind of regional changes have to be made for games to be presented in different cultures. So that's our list. Once again, my name is Adrian, and thanks for watching 10 games censored in localization. Did you have a favorite? Which ones do you think should be on the list? Comment down below and let us know. Remember to click that bell icon to become part of the notification squad. And if you like getting more from your games, subscribe to the leaderboard, your home for video game facts.